it was the first seeds that I started kind of posting in mind, like, watch out, this is coming, this is going to ambush people who don't typically have these conversations. It's the cowardice and it's the lack of reason behind the white nationalists that I think is starting to be exposed. And it gives us a window as people who believe in equity, believe in inclusion. We have a chance to really decimate that foundation of hardcore white violence. When we organize the people who tend to stand up for ideas like QAnon or the propaganda around critical race theory, they're not prepared to bring evidence to the table. And so when we show up and have numbers of people to stand up and correct the record, they lose, and they lose consistently.
A while back, I had the opportunity to talk with Dr. Walter Greason, professor and chair of the Department of History at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. He is an interdisciplinary scholar, historian, urbanist, and economist. I first became aware of his work after the murder of Heather Heyer in the wake of the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. He posted the Racial Violence Syllabus, which attracted over 4 million individual uses, was translated into 7 languages, and inspired projects like the Oscar-winning film BlackKklansman. If you go to his account on Twitter, you'll see a tweet related to this syllabus, and it reads, 15 years ago, I taught a course on collective racial violence in the United States. It is the only course I decided to never teach again. Now, this was the summer of 2017, and since then, Dr. Greason has been sharing information about our history so that we don't repeat it again. He stated, in 2017, we raised awareness about the abiding danger of white supremacy. Please help me take this to the next level. So now as we move into 2022, I was grateful to have the opportunity to talk with Dr. Greason about the impact of his work, what it was like teaching the curriculum, and where we are now, and also gather some advice from him about what we need to do to ensure we have a more equitable society in the years to come. So, without any further ado, here is my interview with Dr. Greason. So I wanted to ask, kind of going back, when you first got on Twitter, well, I mean, you've been on there for a while, but when I saw you, it was this whole racial violence curriculum and this idea of, it sounded really profound. And then you said, I'm not going to teach that again. Right. And so I just wanted to know, I mean, in the context, 2016, we had the Trump election, right? The country was in a very different place as far as its understanding of white supremacy and all that. You know, can you give us a context of what was going on at the time, what inspired you to create that curriculum, and then what was the impact of the curriculum?
Yeah. So timing is perfect, because for a long time, I couldn't find the original syllabus that I taught that course with. And so I just found the original syllabus like 4 weeks ago. So it's just great timing to get into it. But back in 2001, I proposed this course on collective racial violence in the United States, largely because I had become a college student and a graduate student in the decade that followed the LA riots. And there was this presumption that the only riots in American history were when Black people destroyed property in response to police brutality. And this was wildly inaccurate. And so going back and studying the history of rioting and lynching, you realize that most of the violence is white mobs destroying Black people's communities, killing them, torturing them, raping women. Like, it's horrendous. And so the fact that I was learning all this through the late 90s, when I got my first teaching job at Drexel, I was like, that's the course I'm teaching, because everybody is ignoring the facts and doesn't engage. And a lot of scholars did, but it was not getting out to the public. And so I wrote the syllabus. The course was adopted into the curriculum. I taught it in 2002. And it was a 10-week class. Drexel system is not a semester long, it's a quarter system. So I had 10 weeks to try and explain the history of racial violence. And man, by the time I got to the 3rd week, the students were horrified, rightly. 6 weeks in, students were leaving the class to vomit after they had begun to discuss different examples. The final class meeting, students were breaking down and sobbing uncontrollably that they had never seen any of these stories. And that they just didn't understand the accurate history of the United States. And so I came out of that as a young educator, and without really thinking very much about it, was like, okay, that was way too much. You were so determined to tell these histories. You didn't allow for what students could process and how they would have to kind of be cared for going through that effort to learn a different history. And so, yeah, I broke all the content up into 3 separate classes. I continue to teach all that content to this day. But it was in 2017 in the Unite the Right rally when that night, Heather Heyer had been killed. Folks were in shock and horror across the country, and I couldn't sleep, tossed and turned all night. And then when I woke up the next morning, it was 4 or 5 in the morning, and I saw all these people online posting, "This is not us. This is not America." And I was like, yes, yes, it is. And so about 6 a.m. I started Eastern time, I started posting just examples from that course. And then what I had tried to explain, I was like, no, this is very much part of what normally happens when you let white nationalists run wild and believe that they're not going to be held accountable. And so it took about an hour and a half to put the initial set of posts together. And it had reached about 500,000 people in about an hour.
Wow.
And so I immediately, like, I have a decent following, but that took off. And so by the end of the day, it was over like 4 million people had engaged with it for over 2 weeks. It continued to get traction. It got translated into 7 languages. And we had over 4 billion uses of the content in a 2-week span. And so it spun out a lot of different kinds of content that it's done really well. Engagement with Ibram Kendi's work skyrocketed. The 1619 Project spun out of that work. Spike Lee's BlackKklansman movie winning the Oscar was another sign of this, people trying to understand that narrative. So that was the moment when I realized like that content, now the country not just needed it, but was ready to really understand and start the process of grappling with that inheritance, that past, that deadly legacy. And so that's what the Racial Violence Syllabus was. We've done updates to it 3 or 4 times in the last 4 years. Mm-hmm. My book, Industrial Segregation, is largely based on it. And so just being honest about the bloodshed that's embedded in white supremacy, I think, has brought us to a different place today. But we still haven't protected ourselves from the worst consequences.
So, I mean, that's the second question that I had was, we're now in 2022. We have this new president, a Black and Asian vice president for the first time in our history. It gets inaugurated at the beginning of this year. We've had protests against police brutality and racial violence after the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. Where are we now? And, where have things gotten better? Have things gotten worse? What are your thoughts on, now that we're coming into 2022 and what we're seeing around, conversations around critical race theory? What are your thoughts?
So, yeah, I'm a little contrarian. A lot of folks have been very concerned by the way that these conversations have unfolded, the fact that folks from the January 6th insurrection have not been held accountable in the ways that folks from the Black Lives Matter movement have been sanctioned or jailed or punished in some way socially. And so I get that pessimism about the way that white nationalism can reassert itself, particularly at the state and local level. It's extraordinarily dangerous. Rural communities can often be, sundown towns. That hasn't really changed from James Lowen's publication many years ago. But the desperation that I see among the folks who really stand for these ideas, I think of Steve King losing a Republican primary in Iowa, that there is a consensus of moderate to conservative white people and people of all races that maybe don't fall in for progressivism, but they're willing to reject violent white supremacy on a scale that is not really, you haven't seen them willing to stand up against the violent white supremacists in the way that they have in the last year or two. And so it's the cowardice and it's the lack of reason behind the white nationalists that I think is starting to be exposed. And it gives us a window as people who believe in equity and believe in inclusion. We have a chance to really decimate that foundation of hardcore white violence that has defined the United States for so long. And so I work with a lot of people in a variety of communities, whether they're predominantly African American, predominantly Latino, predominantly Asian, or really balanced among different ethnic groups, even really predominantly white communities across the US that are embracing the work and doing the community activism to break down barriers. And so that's been the most telling and, for me, greatest sign of optimism.
And so then, okay, now I'm going to ask, as a historian, right? I didn't really pay attention in history, I'll be honest. I didn't see myself reflected in history. So I thought, I don't need to know any of that, right? I'll focus on the stuff I like. And now I realize, why didn't I pay attention? I talked to another historian, I'm like, I need to learn about McCarthyism. Like, now is the time, right? And so knowing what you know now, you've studied, our history, you've studied different uprisings and kind of responses to progress. What advice would you give just regular folks who, they're not, school board members or not, governors? What can regular people do to help fight for the beloved community that Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about? This idea that we can have a community that is caring and loving and just, what should I be doing as just a regular parent or just a community member to help support efforts that you're making or just regular folks are making to make sure that we have a more just society?
So probably the thing that I found most inspiring out of the last year, and it really came out of the initial days of the pandemic, folks who are doing local community activism across ethnic and barriers of racial segregation in their communities, they're doing some extraordinary things. And so just to give a brief list, this is not even comprehensive at all, but things that started as like reading groups where people begin reading just about new ideas and new ways to think, that they're particularly looking at Black and Latinx and Asian and multiracial authors, and particularly women authors, folks like Bell Hooks, who have expanded on the kind of commitment that she made 30 years ago, 40 years ago, towards human liberation for all people. That engagement is much greater. But most importantly for me, it's turned into mutual aid associations where people are pitching together and sharing food, and looking out for their neighbors. And it's not just within churches, it's often within just secular social groups of people saying, we see a need and we want to come together and actually provide a benefit. And so I've done this at the municipal level in several communities. One of the places I worked with adopted participatory budgeting so that the local community gets to kind of look at what's coming in, what are the revenues, and how do they want to actually have input on the kinds of community outcomes within a 12-year cycle. And so that engagement with the budget has now spread to dozens of communities that they're saying, oh yes, we want people to have more knowledge and more information, more say over what goes on at the local level. And that can grow to the state level as well. I look at something like what happened in Germany. They actually repurchased market rate housing to end their homeless problem. And so they purchased empty units to actually open up the doors and make sure the people on the streets had someplace safe to stay. These are dramatic gestures, but even subtle things like what happened here in Minneapolis. They actually went and said, okay, we're going to change our zoning code so that it's not just single family housing. We're going to allow for more multifamily and duplex kinds of units so that there's more affordable housing throughout the area. It's just endless. Here in St. Paul, there's a legislative mandate to do universal basic income, basically abolishes poverty. And so there's all these ways that we can take action ourselves tomorrow that actually will make the communities stronger, more stable, safer, and better for not just young people, not just seniors, but for everybody.
Thank you. And then one final question, what are you reading, or what should I be reading? What should folks be reading?
That's a dangerous question for me because there's so much. But I would say, of course, at the start, if you haven't picked up any of my books, I've got, like 11 or 12 that have been out now. One that's a good one, although I would say go to your local library and ask for it because it's expensive, is the Encyclopedia for Critical Whiteness Studies in Education.
Ooh.
Long title, Encyclopedia of Critical Whiteness Studies in Education. Really, really good book. If you want something shorter, something more fun that you can read with the kids, my first book, Path to Freedom, was about Black families and migration and building up the foundations of the civil rights movement. And so that's a fun book to get into. Yeah, those are off the top. It depends on kind of youth and where everybody is at. If I was going to say one new scholarly book, hey, I got one. It's a good colleague of mine, Paige Glotzer, has a book, How the Suburbs Were Segregated. And it's the
Ooh, that's a good one.
origins of racial segregation in the United States. And particularly, it's an economic history. It looks at investors who said, we're only going to give money to regional growth if, in fact, we can isolate people that we find undesirable. So this is a long time before the HOLC. It's a long time before the Federal Housing Administration. But Paige does an amazing job of just illustrating how deeply embedded our systems of segregation are.
Thank you so much for joining me and answering my questions. And I'm really, really appreciative. I can share all these resources. Also, I'll share those out. So I'll follow up and we'll get links to everything. And I really, really appreciate your work and your voice on Twitter. All right, well, thank you. I'm glad we finally officially know each other, and
Yes.
We'll definitely keep communicating. And unless I get reported by some more troll bots,
I'll send you my mobile, so you'll be able to stay in touch regardless.
Okay, sounds good. All right, thank you.
Take it
Bye.
easy.
So, what does all this mean? The older I get, the more it becomes evident that when we don't face history, it continues to repeat itself. And maybe that's why we're seeing a racial backlash in classrooms and school boards across the country. They don't want us to know our history. Dr. Greason developed his Racial Violence Syllabus as a response to folks saying, this isn't America. And now in 2022, just a few years after George Floyd protests rock the nation, we're seeing a rise in anti-LGBTQ legislation, repeals on voter rights, and legislation to restrict the teaching of our collective American history. According to Chalkbeat, at the time of this taping, at least 36 states have adopted or introduced laws or policies that restrict teaching about race and racism. And there's new legislation in the pipeline. The GOP has launched an all-out communications war on racial progress by creating a boogeyman out of critical race theory and weaponizing wokeness. These attacks are being directed at school boards across the country. According to a U.S. News and World Report article, between 2006 and 2020, Ballotpedia recorded an average of just 23 recall efforts each year against an average of 52 school board members. But this year, Ballotpedia has tracked 84 school board recall efforts against 215 board members. Count me as one of Recall Mania's victims. In SF, a recall effort raised roughly $2 million in an unprecedented recall election of me and two of my colleagues. Compare this $2 million to the estimated $1 million that all school board members raised in the past 4 school board elections combined. Recall supporters included wealthy billionaires, tech venture capitalists, charter supporters, real estate interests, and even PG&E and Visa. While many recallers want to claim that this is a movement backed by angry parents, we know which angry parents they are talking about. Recall elections are low turnout elections, commonly used to disenfranchise Black, brown, immigrant, and low-income voters. Recallers may want to claim an overwhelming victory, but in reality, only 1/4 of eligible voters voted in this recall, as compared to the average number of voters, which is 3/4 of eligible voters in a normal election. As James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. He also said some notable things about San Francisco racism, as I recall. San Franciscans may want to see themselves as an exception to the rule. In reality, we are seeing similar tactics being utilized across the country. If you're paying attention, there is an entire infrastructure designed to take us back to the 1940s, or worse. If we don't wake up, take action, and make our voices heard, we will lose all the progress we've gained in the last decade. But don't be dismayed. There are folks fighting back. Chalkbeat also tracked efforts in 17 states to expand education on racism, bias, the contributions of specific racial or ethnic groups to the U.S. history, and related topics. There are many educators, students, parents, and community members continuing to push for teaching truth and for schools that are healing spaces for our youth. I know because I talk with these folks every day. In upcoming episodes, I will talk with some of the amazing activists and scholars who are fighting to defend progress. We'll get educated and take action. Just Talks is written and produced by yours truly, Allie Collins. I'm an educator, writer, organizer, and parent. I'm making this video so we can get educated and take action to protect our public education system and advance education justice. This podcast is free, but it's not free to make. If you would like to ensure that I keep producing more episodes, please visit my Patreon at patreon.com/Allie Collins Production. Support my guests by visiting the links in the description below, and please like and share this podcast video.